So Shadow of the Artorius has been out for a few months now, so I think it's time for us to head back and look at FromSoftware's history with their DLCs and put them in a tier list and rank them against each other. The very first Souls DLC was Artorius of the Abyss, so let's just start with that. Now, Artorius of the Abyss is an absolutely excellent DLC. This game added some of the best bosses in all of Dark Souls 1. Of course, the base game of Dark Souls 1 had some amazing bosses with Gwen and Ornstein and Smough, but I do believe outside of those two, all the best bosses in Dark Souls 1 come from Artorius of the Abyss. You have Calamity, you have Manus, you have Artorius, which are all some of the best bosses in all of Dark Souls 1. Even Sanctuary Guardian, who's not as good as them, I still think he would be better than almost all Dark Souls 1 base game bosses. Now, boss-wise, Artorius of the Abyss is very stacked, especially for the time that it came out. But in terms of level design, I do think it's a bit on the weaker side. Now, is that bad by any means? I don't think so, but I don't think the exploration is all that good. Exploration is one of my favorite parts of Dark Souls 1. So the fact that it does lack in that is kind of disappointing. But again, I don't think it's weak level design. I just think it's worse than the first half of Dark Souls 1, but stronger than the second half. So it's a nice little middle ground. I do think the main appeal of Artorius of the Abyss is the lore and the boss fights. Now, I think overall it has aged really well even by today's standards. So I'll be giving Artorius of the Abyss an A tier. Going by release order, the next pick is Sunen King. This was the first Dark Souls 2 DLC, and I do believe it's the weakest FromSoft DLC. Now, do I think it's bad? By no means. I want to get into the positive first before we start talking about the negatives, because I think this DLC unfortunately does have a lot of negatives. Number one positive thing I can say about this DLC is its atmosphere is amazing. Top notch. I love it. But the main positive about this DLC that makes it worth playing, and the reason I always play it, is Sin. Now, I know some people don't like Sin for some reason, but I really like him. I think he's one of the best dragon fights. I think he was the best dragon fight until Dark Souls 3 with Midir. I really do like him. Of course, he is outdated in some ways. I do think his fight could have been balanced better. But for the time, I think he's great. Now on to the negatives. I will say outside of Sin, this DLC has absolutely trash bosses. They're horrible. Now, Alana isn't awful, I guess, but the Gang Squad could be argued as the worst boss in the entire series. It's just 3 NPCs that have no synergy together thrown into one room. But that's optional. I could forgive that. That's optional content. The main problem is the normal enemies of this DLC are absolutely annoying to get through, and that's unfortunate because I think the level design of this place is honestly pretty awesome. I think it's really cool, but the enemies are so awful that I don't even want to get through this place. They're so annoying. The whole area is like a maze, but that can be good if you weren't dealing with the worst enemies in the franchise. Overall, Sunen King is a pretty solid DLC, and I'll give it a C tier, but it is the worst out of the bunch from Souls DLCs. The next released Dark Souls 2 DLC was the Old Iron King DLC, and I would say setting-wise, it's probably one of the more interesting DLCs. I think Broom Tower is an excellent location, both for exploration and visually. I do think the exploration does suffer by enemy design like most Dark Souls 2 areas, but I think the area level design is just so good and interesting where it makes up for it mostly. I really do enjoy exploring Broom Tower most of the time. Now, even though I generally do believe Broom Tower is amazing, the real reason this DLC is this high on the list is because of the boss cast. This DLC has arguably the 2 best bosses in Dark Souls 2. Fume Knight is one of the greatest bosses in all of Souls history, period. And Sir Alona is also a fantastic boss. I do believe he is held back by his boss run. Without the boss run, he could be an easy contender for one of the best bosses of all time. But right now, I believe Fume Knight takes it. And Fume Knight, man, he's just enough to put this DLC super high for me. He's one of my favorite bosses. His moveset ages so well even today. His whole fight feels like a dance. And those are my favorite kind of fights. I never get tired of fighting him. I have fought him probably more than any other boss because of Boundfire aesthetic, which is one of Dark Souls 2's best feature. But no, I absolutely love this DLC. Does it have flaws? Absolutely. The Blue Smelter Demon. Why do we have a reused boss? That sucks in this DLC. And the areas obviously can be annoying with the enemies, but I do think it's the best in Dark Souls 2, and I believe it has a lot of content, so it makes up for it. 2 of the best bosses, really interesting level design, really cool lore. I think it's overall a great package. With everything being said, I will be giving Old Iron King an A tier above Artorius of the Abyss slightly. I know that may be controversial, but that's how I'm feeling right now. I want you guys to know it's very interchangeable. My opinion could change tomorrow, but right now that's what I'm feeling. And the next release from Software DLC was Crown of the Ivory King, which was the final Dark Souls 2 DLC. Now this DLC is overall a great package. It does have some negatives, of course, but every DLC has that. Ilium Lois is the best area in Dark Souls 2, first of all, and has arguably the best boss in Dark Souls 2. I absolutely love Ivory King. Even today, I think the gimmick he has is very unique, and I love it. Fighting alongside the knights is just incredibly hype. It's very cinematic, has a lot of spectacle, and the Ivory King himself has an incredible moveset. I just love his moveset. I love the visuals of that fight. Only complaint is I do feel like that fight can drag on a little bit too long on replays. Like if you die to him, you have to fight for 20 minutes to get to him again, which can be annoying. But outside of that, I think the fight is very fun. I don't have critiques about it outside of what I mentioned. The only problem with this DLC is it has arguably the worst area in the entire franchise with the Frigid Outskirts. And outside the Ivory King, there isn't really too many good bosses. Alba is a decent boss, but I think it is brought down by the fact that Lud and Zullen are exactly the same as Alva, but a gank fight, so I'm not a fan of that. But overall, I would say this DLC is a B tier, but it could lean to an A tier as we go further down. I really like it. The next released DLC is Old Hunters. A lot of people consider this to be the best FromSoft DLC even today. It's almost been 10 years since this DLC came out, and it's a lot of people's favorite. Now, this DLC is the first DLC we have on the list so far that I have nothing bad to say about. Only positive. This DLC is absolute perfection from start to finish. Honestly, I wouldn't even say Bloodborne would be in my top 10 games if it wasn't for this DLC. But this DLC gave it the boost it needed. Now it's one of my favorite games of all time, and it's been in my top 10 for like 5 to 6 years now. So it's an unbelievable DLC, one of the best ever. But what makes this DLC super good? You could go into everything. For one, I would say it's the climax of Bloodborne in terms of its story. Old Hunter just fills in so many gaps that we knew in the base game, but we didn't have full info on, and it's just so amazing. Learning about Lawrence, learning about Cos, about what the Hunters did, the tragedy of the Clock Tower, the fishing hamlet, it's all just some of the best storytelling in FromSoft, period, not just in Bloodborne. Next up is the bosses. The 3 best bosses in Bloodborne, arguably, all come from Old Hunters. One of my favorite bosses of all time, in my top 5, Orphan of Cos, comes in Old Hunters and is the conclusion to this DLC. And this DLC has absolutely one of the best conclusions ever. Like, oh my god, freeing Cos and sending him back to sea is such a fulfilling ending to this amazing story and this amazing DLC. And those are not even the only positive. The music of this DLC is just next level. Every single boss has an amazing soundtrack attached to them. And of course, Bloodborne is known for its atmosphere, and this DLC continues the trend of Bloodborne having an amazing atmosphere. Absolutely love this DLC, and it will be the first DLC to get an S tier, completely above every DLC we have mentioned so far. Just perfection, there's no other way to describe it. And now we're on to Dark Souls 3. The first released Dark Souls 3 DLC was Ashes of Arendo, and I would describe this DLC in one word: freed. Because outside of her, this DLC has nothing to offer. The area, while visually cool, you can finish it in 15 minutes. It's very quick, not much going on, not a lot of exploration. It's just a very quick area. Lore-wise, I think there's some cool implications there, but again, not really expanded upon until later with Ring City. So as a standalone, there really isn't much going on with this DLC. There's 2 bosses. One is Sister Freed, which is an amazing boss, one of the best from Software has ever made, and you have Champion Grave Attender, which is an NPC with a big wolf you see earlier in the DLC. I just really don't see much appeal in this DLC, especially because it costs $15, which is the same cost as another DLC we're going to talk about soon, and that DLC is just so much better. Keep in mind, Old Hunters costed $20, so this DLC is $5 cheaper than Old Hunters, and it has less content than every Dark Souls 2 DLC. I'm going to be giving this DLC a C tier above Sunen King because of Freed, but not much positive things to say about it from me. And finally, we are on to our last Dark Souls 3 DLC, Ring City. I absolutely love this DLC. This was at one point my favorite DLC in FromSoft history. It has one of my favorite bosses, a boss that a lot of people consider to be the best in the entire series within Gale. Gale is just so amazing, man. I could talk about him for hours. His boss arena is one of the best. His OST and his third phase is the best phase in any Souls game. It's the best fight ever. Mechanically, spectacle, hype, it's just amazing. But we're not here to talk about Gale. We're here to talk about the whole DLC. But Gale is a major reason of why I love this DLC, but he's not the only thing. Midir is also one of my favorite bosses of all time. Both him and Gale are in my top 5 DLC bosses in all of FromSoft history, so I really adore them. Now, there is more to this DLC. I would say Ring City has the best area in all of Dark Souls 3. Ring City has actually a pretty good area to explore. The enemies are fun. The Ring Knights are super fun to fight. One of some of the best in the entire franchise. And I think that fixes most of the issues with Dark Souls 3, because I think Dark Souls just has weak areas in general. But this DLC doesn't have a weak area. It sure has some bad parts. Like I think the swamp is pretty annoying, and before you reach the Ring City, it's not the best. But overall, I think it's a pretty great package for Dark Souls 3. And boss-wise, it's just a 10 out of 10. You got Gale, Medir, Demon Prince. You do have Half-Light stinging it up, but it's just a PvP fight, and I usually don't mind those. And you can make it quick, get the fight over with pretty quickly. So with that all being said, I'll be giving Ring City an S tier, right under Old Hunters. I just think Old Hunter has more to offer, but Ring City is still an amazing DLC, and top 3 on this list. And finally, we have Shadow of the Artree, the most recently released From Software Souls DLC, and in my opinion, spoiler alert, the best DLC. Now, this DLC was very controversial when it came out. People were saying that FromSoft overdid it, the DLC is just too hard, the bosses move too quickly. But as time went on, people have softened their opinions on the DLC, and I think that's because of the Shadow Tree fragments. People tried to fight the bosses without those, and without those, these bosses are almost impossible. They're very hard. There are people that have beat them, obviously, just like every Souls challenge run, but you're not supposed to fight them without the Shadow Tree fragments, and I think that's a mistake people were making. I'm honestly guilty of that too, I'll be honest. I was saying this DLC is too hard, especially within Radon, but one replay made me realize how amazing this DLC is from top to down. Now, where do we even begin with this DLC, man? First of all, the boss in this DLC were amazing. Was there some stinkers? Yes. Gaius, Metir, they were not very good. But to make up for them, you had bosses like Mesmer, Relana, Dancing Lion, Redon. All of these guys were... Oh, Midra, how could I forget Midra? All of these guys were absolutely amazing and some of my favorite bosses ever. The areas were all stunning. This DLC added 6 new weapon types. That's just fucking absurd. They were in their bag while making this DLC. And it's not only within the bosses and weapons that this DLC is amazing. And this DLC is literally amazing in every single category. It has some of the most beautiful areas I have seen in all of gaming, and the most beautiful areas in all of Souls. And the level design, I'm going to say, it may be a hot take, I think it's the best in the entire franchise. The legacy dungeons of this game are so well done. Shadowkeep is in my top 3 favorite areas ever. That legacy dungeon is just absolutely amazing. Has beautiful atmosphere, great bosses in it, and the interconnectivity is amazing. Tons of loot for exploration. I just can't think of a single thing that Shadowkeep misses on. And even minor things like NPC quest lines, I would say that this DLC has the best NPC quest lines in the whole franchise. Angspark, Letta, Saint Trina, Theolier, all of these guys are some of my favorite NPCs in all of Souls. I think just the amazing package of all of them together is just absolutely amazing. Now, I will acknowledge some of the flaws in this DLC. People say it has way too many empty areas. I really don't think it does. I think the empty areas were sacrificed for atmosphere, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. Elden Ring is filled with content. I think some areas just going for atmosphere is completely fine. I do think some areas like Abyssal Woods could have been shorter, but outside of that, I really enjoy all these areas. Another thing is people say the bosses are lackluster. I just do not see that. Like I said, I can acknowledge that Gaius and Meteor are not very good, but outside of those two, I really do enjoy every boss. Like Patricia Knight, even I think is a fun boss. With that all being said, I'm sure you can tell what my rating is going to be. I already kind of spoiled it, but I will be giving Elden Ring an S tier, the highest S tier on this list. With everything being said, here's our final look at the tier list. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and let me know what you think, and let me know how you would rank the DLCs, where you disagree with me, where you agree with me. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like and maybe subscribe. Thank you for watching.